I want to tell you something about the way ordinary things end. Not with ceremony, not with a fanfare or a speech or a camera crew. Most endings arrive the way the last morning of anything arrives, quietly, wearing the same clothes as every other morning, so you don't know to look at it differently until it's already passed. I retired from the Venn Street Transit Authority after 31 years. Infrastructure planning mostly. Culverts and cable runs and the unglamorous arithmetic of how a city keeps its blood moving underground. My wife Dorothea had wanted me to travel after she had a list. She had always had a list, but Dorothea died 18 months before I filed the retirement papers, and after that the list seemed like a document in a foreign language. So I stayed. I kept the house on Callow Street, which my colleagues had taken to calling Marsh's Street as a joke that stopped being a joke somewhere around year 20. And every morning I walked the 4 blocks to the corner of Venn and Aldrich and sat at the window counter of a cafe called The Tyne. And I drank coffee and watched the transit hub across the street operate the way I had helped design it to operate. And that was enough. I am not a romantic. I want that on the record early. I am a man who spent 3 decades arguing with city engineers about load tolerances and soil permeability, and what that does to a person is it makes you very precise about what is actually in front of you and very suspicious of what isn't. Dorothea used to say I had the soul of a drainage survey. She meant it with love. I took it as a compliment. I tell you all of this because I want you to understand that what I noticed about Seraph Hanul, I noticed the way I would notice a structural anomaly. Quietly, without drama, simply because my eyes were trained to see things that didn't fit the load-bearing assumptions of the world around them. She was there the 3rd morning after I began my retirement routine, sitting 2 stools down from me at the Tyne's window counter. She was already there when I arrived. She had a cup of something dark in front of her, and she was watching the transit hub the way I watched the transit hub, which is to say with the focused, proprietary attention of someone who had thought carefully about how it worked. I noticed that first. Not her appearance, though her appearance was notable, but the quality of her attention. Most people who sat at that counter were checking devices, or talking at each other, or watching the street the way you watch a screen, passively, without any sense that the thing on the other side of the glass had inner workings worth considering. She watched the hub the way an engineer watches a machine. She was Keth. That was the colloquial term the city used for her species, though I learned later it was not their word for themselves, and carried a mildly pejorative undertone that most of the city's population was too incurious to have noticed. The Keth had been a legal resident species in the city for 11 years by then, arriving through a treaty process I had read about only in the transit infrastructure implications, expanded platform loading tolerances, new signage protocols, updated emergency egress calculations. There were perhaps 4,000 of them in the city. They kept to themselves, largely, in the northern residential belt, and the city largely let them, which is another way of saying the city was not especially interested. She had, and I will describe this carefully and accurately, because I was a careful and accurate observer, a complexion that sat between pale bronze and deep amber, shifting depending on the quality of light in the room, which I found unusual enough to note on the first morning, and then simply accepted as a physical fact by the second. Her eyes were very dark, almost entirely iris, and set in a way that gave her face an expression of permanent, settled thoughtfulness, even when she was not thinking about anything in particular. Her hair was dark and cut practically short, growing to a slight point above each temple where hairline met brow, and at each temple the hairline itself had a faint secondary color, a deep, muted blue-violet that I initially attributed to some cosmetic choice and later understood was not cosmetic at all. Her hands on the counter were long-fingered and still. She did not fidget. She did not perform the anxious, low-grade restlessness that most people perform when sitting alone in public. She simply sat and watched and drank whatever was in her cup. I did not speak to her on the 3rd morning. I had no reason to. I spoke to her on the 7th morning, and it was because of the coffee. She had been there each of the intermediate mornings, always present when I arrived, always gone before the hour turned. On the 7th morning, the Tynes counter staff had changed. The young man who normally worked the window counter had been replaced by a woman who was new and had not yet learned the rhythms of the regular customers. I watched her bring the wrong thing to Chirrek, a pale, milky drink where the dark cup should have been, and watched Chirrek accept it without correction, her face showing nothing. And I thought, this woman has been given the wrong thing and does not consider herself entitled to say so. I had seen that before. In 31 years of infrastructure meetings and budget negotiations and interdepartmental committees, I had watched certain kinds of people, usually the ones with the least formal power in the room, accept incorrect things in silence because the calculus of correction seemed to cost more than the error. It was a very specific quiet. I recognized it. I said to the counter woman across the 2 empty stools between us, "She takes the dark roast, the steep brewed one, not the pressure pot. No milk." The counter woman looked at me, looked at Chirrek, looked back at me. Chirrek looked at me. I said, "I've been sitting here for a week. It's what she has every morning." I nodded toward the cup. "That's not it." There was a pause of the kind that happens when someone has been seen doing something they considered invisible. The counter woman took the cup back without argument and brought the right one. Chirrek held the corrected cup in both hands for a moment before she drank. Then she said, and her voice was low and even, with an accent I couldn't place regionally, something that moved through consonants very cleanly and gave each word a slight finality at its end. "You have been here 7 mornings. "Retired," I said, "nothing else to do with the time." She looked at me without expression for a moment that was slightly longer than comfortable. Then she looked back at the transit hub. "The number 6 line," she said, "the eastbound platform. The drainage grate on the near edge." I looked. "What about it?" "It is the wrong grade. In a significant rain event, water will pool at the boarding edge rather than channeling toward the main drain. The slip risk will be non-trivial." I looked at the grate for a moment. She was right. I had looked at that grate 400 times in my career, and no one had flagged it, including me. "Retired," I said again. "Not my problem anymore." "No," she said, "but you see it now." She was right about that too. Her name, she told me on the 9th morning. She had arrived to find me already seated, and seemed to recalibrate something very slightly at the reversal, was Chirrek null. The second word, she explained, was a locational suffix that indicated temporary residential status in Keth naming convention, not a family name. In her culture system, a name changed with where you were. She was null because she was here, in this city, in a category of presence that her naming system had a word for. A person who is somewhere they were not expected to be. I told her my name was Marsh, which was what everyone called me, and my surname was Callow, which was also now the name of the street, which I acknowledged was a slightly embarrassing legacy of 3 decades of municipal habit. She said, "You are the reason the street has a name." The department named it. I tried to stop them. She considered this. "They named it without your consent." "They did." Something crossed her face that I could not fully read, not quite amusement and not quite sympathy, but in the vicinity of both. She looked back at the hub. "The number 6 line grate," she said. "I reported it to the transit authority 11 days ago." I looked at her. "They sent an acknowledgement," she said, "and then nothing." I pulled out my phone and sent an email to a man named Briscoe who owed me a professional debt and was currently a structural review supervisor. The subject line was 4 words, "Number 6 eastbound grate." The body was 8 words, "Drainage grade error, slip risk, check it today." Chirrek watched me type and send it. "He'll look at it," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "Then, you did not ask me to document the error more formally, or to go through a different channel, or to wait. You already did the right thing, I said. The system failed. I know someone in the system, that's all. She held her cup in both hands again, that particular way she had, that made me think she was measuring warmth through her palms. She said nothing further, but she did not leave before the hour turned that morning. She stayed another 40 minutes and we did not speak again, but the quality of the silence was different from the earlier silences. I noticed that too. I should tell you about the mornings, because that is where most of this happened. Not in dramatic incidents or revelatory conversations, but in the slow accumulation of one morning after another, each one nearly identical to the last, and each one fractionally different from it in ways that only mattered if you were paying the kind of attention I had spent a career learning to pay. I brought her the dark roast before she arrived, on the mornings when I arrived first. I did not announce this or make anything of it. I simply placed it at her usual stool and ordered my own. She never thanked me explicitly. What she did, and I noticed this on the third morning it happened, which meant I had missed it the first two, was that when she sat down and saw the cup already waiting, she moved it exactly 1 inch toward her preferred position on the counter before touching it. A small proprietary gesture, an acceptance. I learned what she noticed. She noticed structural things, drainage and load, and the way weight distributed across public infrastructure. She noticed when children in the street were separated from the adults they had arrived with, and she would track with her eyes until the reconnection happened, and only then look away. She noticed sound anomalies. Once she paused mid-sentence and tilted her head, and 30 seconds later a pressure alarm sounded from somewhere in the transit hub's mechanical basement. An alarm that turned out to be a minor thing, but that she had heard coming before any of the hub's own systems registered it. She noticed me, specifically. She noticed when I was tired, when I had slept poorly, when something in my face was off from the baseline she had apparently established for me, and she would not mention it directly but would adjust the ratio of silence to conversation in that morning's session in a way that gave me more room. She did not, in the first several weeks, tell me anything about herself that I had not directly and specifically asked. I did not ask often. I am not an asker. Dorothea had complained about this for 33 years with affectionate exasperation. She said I treated personal conversation like an infrastructure survey, only collecting data I had a specific reason to need, and I had always thought this was not entirely a criticism. Sarah did not seem to experience it as a deficiency. She seemed, if anything, to find it restful. What I observed without asking, she was cold. Not temperamentally, she was precise and still and economical in her manner, but not cold in feeling, physically cold. In the warmest weeks of that first autumn, she wore a coat that was too heavy for the weather by 2 or 3 gradations, and she held her cup with both hands even when the cafe was warm. And I once, passing her stool when she had turned away, saw the condensation from a cold glass she had briefly held evaporate from the counter in a way that made me think she was drawing heat out of surfaces rather than into them. Keth physiology. I did not ask. I simply made sure, on the mornings I arrived first, that I asked for her cup to be heated slightly longer than usual. She noticed that, of course she did. I asked her, around the 6-week mark, what she did for work. Not because I needed to know, but because after 6 weeks of structural observations and transit system critiques of considerable technical sophistication, I thought it was a natural question. She said she worked in material testing, stress analysis. She tested load tolerances on components for a contractor who worked for several of the city's infrastructure departments, which explained the sophistication of her observations. She had been doing this for 3 years in the city. Before this city, she had worked in a similar capacity elsewhere. I said, "Do you like it?" She paused in the way she paused when a question had surprised her, a brief recalibration, not quite hesitation. "It is what the posting requires," she said. I looked at her. That's not an answer to the question I asked. Another pause longer. "No," she said finally. I don't like it, I am good at it. Those are not the same thing. What would you like to be doing? She looked at the transit hub for a long time. She said, I would like to understand how cities decide to become what they become. The choices, not the engineering, the decisions behind the engineering. Why a drainage system is built to a certain tolerance and not a better one. Why a transit line goes to one district and not another. The politics inside the infrastructure. I said, that is exactly what I spent 31 years doing. She looked at me. I said we could talk about it. We talked about it most mornings for the next 11 months. I want to be honest about what those mornings were. They were not a romance, in the sense that word usually means. I was 58 years old and I had loved one person for 33 years and she was dead, and the space that created did not feel like a vacancy waiting to be filled. It felt like a room I visited and kept clean. Whatever was happening at the Times window counter was something else. It was, and I have thought about the right word for a long time, fellowship. The fellowship of two people who pay careful attention to the same kinds of things and have found, without particularly searching, the rare condition of each other's company. I told her about Dorothea. Not often, but on the mornings when Dorothea was present in a particular way, I would say something and Sarevha would listen with the kind of listening that is not about preparing a response. I told her about the 31 years, the budget fights, the culverts, the cable runs, the specific unglamorous pride of building things that worked. She listened to all of it. She asked very specific questions, not about feelings, which I would not have known how to answer, but about mechanics. Why that decision? What was the constraint? How did you resolve the conflict between those two requirements? They were the questions I would have asked. She told me, in pieces, over months, that she had come to this city because the posting had been available, and that available postings at her level were determined by factors above her that she did not control and was not asked to influence. That she had come from a long way away. That she had family in the way that people had family, but that her family's structure was different from human family structure in ways she found difficult to explain in a single conversation, and I did not press her on. That she had been learning this city the way she had learned each city before it, systematically, from the infrastructure outward, because infrastructure was the honest record of a city's values and everything else was argument. I said once, "Do you miss wherever you came from?" She said, "I miss certain things about it. I do not miss being who I was required to be there." I said, "Who were you required to be?" She looked at me for a long moment, then she looked at the hub. "Someone who did not choose her own mornings," she said. I did not push on that. There was a morning in the second winter, the 11th month of our acquaintance, when she was not there. I arrived at the Tyne and her stool was empty and her cup was not there, and I sat and ordered and waited, and she did not come. I told myself this meant nothing. People had days when their routine changed. I had had days like that myself. I drank my coffee and watched the hub and went home. She was not there the second morning. I am not a worrier by nature. But on the second morning, I found myself looking at her empty stool with something that was not quite worry but lived in the same neighborhood. It was the look you give a structural element that has been quiet for too long when quiet is not what you'd expect. On the third morning, I asked Fenn, the regular counter staff member who knew both of us by routine if not by name, whether she had seen the regular woman with the dark roast who sat 2 stools down. Fenn said she hadn't the last 3 days, and asked if I wanted her to leave a note if she came in while I was gone. I said yes. On the 4th morning, I went to the address I had, which was a piece of information I did not remember deliberately acquiring, but found I had acquired the way you acquire things in a long, continuous attention. From a piece of mail I had once seen at the top of her bag on a day when she'd come from the post office, a street name and number I'd filed without meaning to. I went there before the Tyne opened, and I stood in front of a building in the northern residential belt, and I knocked on the door of the address and I waited. Sarevha opened the door. She was in different clothes than I had seen her in before, not the practical coat and the careful, unremarkable human-adjacent attire she wore every morning, but something that sat differently on her. A deeper color, a longer line, a fabric that moved when she moved in a way that her usual clothes did not. Her hair had something in it at the temples, not jewelry exactly, more like a structural element, a narrow band of something dark and metallic that ran along each temple's hairline and caught the morning light once and did not catch it again, as if it absorbed more than it reflected. She looked at me without speaking. I said, "You weren't there." She said, "No." I said, "Are you all right?" She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Please come in." The interior of her apartment was not what I expected, though I could not have told you what I expected. It was very ordered. It was also not set up quite the way a human living space was set up. The furniture was present, but the relationships between pieces were slightly different, as if organized by a logic that prioritized sightlines and exit routes over social groupings. The walls had nothing on them except in one corner, where there was something that looked at first like a framed textile, deep blue-violet shot through, with a pattern I kept not being able to resolve into anything definite. And the longer I looked at it, the more strongly I felt it was not decorative in the way decorative things were decorative. She made something hot, not the dark roast, something different, and brought it to the table and sat across from me. She said, "I have been asked to return." I said, "Return where?" She said, "Home." I waited. She said, the people I came from. They have been requesting my return for some time. I have been managing the request." She stopped. "That is not quite accurate. I have been declining it, which is not the same as managing it, and the distinction has consequences I have been postponing." I looked at her. She looked at the textile on the wall. "The reason I am able to decline is complicated. The reason the consequences are becoming unavoidable is also complicated. I did not tell you about this because it did not seem like something that belonged to our mornings. I did not want it to belong to our mornings." I said, "What is it that you're not telling me?" She was quiet for a long time. The light in the apartment shifted. It was early still, the winter sun very low, and in the shifted light, the two narrow bands at her temples caught something and held it, and I looked at them properly for the first time, and I thought, that is not a cosmetic choice, and it is not a physical feature. That is a thing that is being worn, a thing that was made and put on and has a meaning. She said, and her voice was the same even voice it always was, with its clean consonants and its slight final weight on each word. "I am not, in the way that you understand such things, a materials testing analyst on a municipal infrastructure contract." I said, "No, I didn't think you were really." She looked at me. "You knew." "I knew something didn't fit," I said. "The way you assessed that grate on the first morning. No contractor's analyst talks about a drainage grade the way you talked about it. You talked about it like someone responsible for outcomes, not someone measuring components. I didn't know what it meant. I knew it didn't fit the explanation you gave." She held her cup in both hands the way she always held it, measuring warmth. "I am responsible for outcomes," she said. "In a sense, in the system I come from, I have responsibilities I have been declining to exercise." "What kind of responsibilities?" She looked at me steadily. "The kind that don't allow you to choose your own mornings." I remembered saying that back to her. I remembered her saying it the first time. Something settled into place, with the heaviness of a thing that has been waiting to settle. I said, "What happens when you decline long enough?" She said, "They come." I said, "When?" She said, "I believe soon. That is why I did not come to the time these 4 days. I needed to think about what I was going to do, and I found that I could not think clearly at the time because I kept thinking about the morning instead of the problem. and that is not useful. It is not what I should be doing with my time. I said, why couldn't you think clearly at the time? She looked at her cup. She did not answer for long enough that I thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she said, because it is the place I chose. Every morning for 2 years I chose it. And what is coming will end the choosing, one way or another. And I found that I could not sit at the counter and look at the transit hub and think about that simultaneously. I said, what do you want to do? She looked up at me, and I saw, for the first time, something in her face that was not the precise, settled composure I had catalogued and relied on for 2 years. It was not distress, exactly. It was the expression of someone who has been a long way from home for a long time and has stopped being sure what home is supposed to feel like. She said, I don't know. I said, what would be true if you went back? She said, I would be who they need me to be. I would be useful to a great many people. I would have responsibility and consequence and continuity. I would not be null anymore. I said, what would you be? She said, my name there is longer. It is old. It has been the same for a very long time. I thought about that. Then I said, what would be true if you didn't? She said, I would keep choosing my mornings. A pause for a while. I said, for how long a while? She said, I don't know, until the consequences of declining caught up with the value of the choosing. I don't know where that line is. I said, has the choosing been worth it? She was very still. Then she said, yes. I said, then that's what you know. She looked at me for a long time. Outside the window of her apartment, the winter light was coming up properly now, pale and even, the kind of light that doesn't flatter anything but also doesn't hide anything. In that light, the bands at her temples had the quality of something very old kept in very good condition. I looked at them and thought about that textile on the wall, and the way she watched the transit hub, and the way she had said, the politics inside the infrastructure, the decisions behind the decisions. I said, what are you exactly, back home? She said, there is not a word in your language that maps cleanly onto it. I said, give me the closest one. She looked at me. Then she said, something between what you would call a steward and what you would call a sovereign. The person responsible for the system, you might say. The person who understands the infrastructure from the inside and has to decide how it runs. I said, a planner. Something crossed her face, that expression I had never fully read, the one that lived between amusement and something deeper. She said, yes, a very senior planner. I said, then you know what I'm going to tell you. She said, tell me anyway. I said, the system doesn't stop needing a planner because the planner wants a different job, and a planner who understands the system from the inside is more valuable to the people inside it than they are to themselves. You know this. You said it to me in different words about the transit authority. You said, the person responsible for outcomes has to be in the room. She was quiet. I said, I'm not telling you what to do. I can't tell you what to do, but I think you already know what you're going to do. You've known for a while. I think the 4 days were you being sure you knew. She looked at her cup. She said, I have been here 2 years. I said, I know. She said, I have not been. I have not had mornings like this before this. I said, neither have I not since Dorothea. She looked up at me. There was something in her eyes that was not quite tears, something that in different biology would be what tears are, a visible registration of something too large for the moment to contain. She held it without spilling it. She had always been very good at that. She said, I'm sorry. I said, don't be sorry for it. It was worth it. She held my eyes for a long moment. Then she nodded once with the precision that she did everything. I went home. I did not go to the Tyne the next morning. I cleaned the house, which it did not strictly need, and I walked the street, Callow Street, with its embarrassing legacy, and looked at the drainage grates the way I always looked at drainage grates. assessing grade and flow and the gap between what existed and what would work better. And I thought about a woman who could hear a pressure alarm before the instruments could, and who knew the difference between a system and its values, and who had chosen for 2 years. The same counter stool and the same dark roast and the same winter-heavy coat in the warmest weeks, and I thought, that was a very good 2 years. I was at the Tyne on the following morning. Her stool was empty. I had expected it to be empty. I sat at the counter and ordered and looked at the hub. And then the sky did something. It did not do it loudly, which surprised me. I had always assumed that if a fleet of vessels appeared over a city, the sound would be the first thing, a pressure wave, a deep resonance, something atmospheric and unmistakable. What actually happened was that the light changed. The light over Venn Street shifted by about 10 degrees in color temperature, toward a blue that had no winter equivalent in natural light, and people on the street below stopped and looked up in the way. People look up when they don't yet know they should be alarmed. And then they knew they should be alarmed, and the street became very loud. I looked up through the Tyne's window and counted 7 vessels above the transit hub, arranged in a formation that was precisely symmetrical in a way. No natural cloud formation was symmetrical, sitting in the sky as if the sky had specific load-bearing tolerances and they had calculated them correctly. I thought, that is an infrastructure-minded people. The street outside was chaos. People running, people filming, people standing paralyzed in the particular way that people stand when they have run out of behavioral protocols. The transit hub's public address system came on and said something about an unscheduled service interruption. Fenn, behind the counter, had her hands to her mouth. And then the door of the Tyne opened. She had changed again. The coat was gone. What she wore was the color of the deep sky just before dark, and it sat on her differently than anything I had seen her wear, not like clothing exactly, but like an expression of what she was in the way that a building's facade expresses what the building was built to be. The bands at her temples were uncovered. In the light coming off the vessels outside, they were not dark and matte as I had seen them in her apartment. They caught it and held it and gave it back in a color that I did not have a word for, that sat between the blue of deep water and the violet of something I had only seen in the secondary tone of her hairline, and the effect was not decorative but declarative, in the way that a structural column is not decorative. It is there because it holds something up. She walked through the Tyne, and the room was very quiet in the way rooms go quiet when they understand that something is happening that they did not have the category for. She walked to the window and looked at the hub and the street and the 7 vessels in the formation overhead, and her face was the face I knew, composed, settled, precise, and also not quite that face, because the composure now had weight behind it that I had not seen before, the weight of something that had been withheld for 2 years returning to its natural resting place. She looked at the vessels for a long moment, then she turned. She looked at the room looked at her. Fenn had not moved. The 3 other customers at the counter had not moved. She looked at me, and she said, in the same even voice, the same clean consonants, the same slight final weight at the end of each word, Marsh. Just that, my name. I said, morning. Something moved across her face that I will not try to translate precisely, because I do not think I have the vocabulary for it, and I am suspicious of the kind of man who would pretend he did. What I can tell you is that it was not the expression of a person saying goodbye. It was the expression of a person who has decided that something will not be lost just because its form is going to change. She looked at the door. She looked back at me. She said, the number 6 eastbound grate was repaired. I said, I know. Briscoe sent me the documentation. She said, good. She looked at me for another moment. Then she moved toward the door, and as she moved, the shape of the room seemed to understand something about what was happening, and everyone in it, Fenn, the 3 other customers, a man who had come in off the street and was standing in the doorway, his phone up, Filming, all of them were very still, in the way that witnesses to something they do not fully understand but correctly sense is significant tend to go still. At the door she paused. She turned to the room, to all of it, to the filming man and the still customers and Finn with her hands at her mouth, and she said, in a voice that was slightly louder than her usual voice and carried the quality of a statement rather than a conversation, "This man," she looked at me, and in the light from outside the bands at her temples held their impossible color, "brought me coffee for 2 years before I asked for it. He fixed the drainage grate on the number 6 line. He told me the truth when I needed it and asked nothing in return." She paused. "I would like that on the record." The room did not move. I said, "It's a cafe, Sarevha. There isn't a record." She said, "There is now." She looked at me a moment more. Then she walked out of the Tyne and into Venn Street, and across the empty cleared space in front of the hub, and toward the point where the vessel above had lowered something. Not a ramp or a door in any mechanical sense I recognized, but an opening that the air made, a seam in the ordinary light that was also an entrance to something that had its own light inside. She did not look back. She walked like a planner who knows the load tolerances of the system she is returning to and has made her peace with the weight of it. I sat at the counter and I finished my coffee. The vessel stayed above Venn Street for approximately 40 minutes. I was informed later by a very agitated city official who called me that afternoon because the filming man's footage had circulated, and several people in it were asking who the man at the counter was, and then they were not there. The blue-shifted light became ordinary winter light again. The transit hub resumed operations. Briscoe texted me a photograph of the repaired number 6 grate with the caption, "Good catch." Who spotted it? I put my phone in my pocket and looked at the empty stool 2 seats down. I thought about 31 years of culverts and cable runs, and the unglamorous arithmetic of how a city keeps its blood moving underground, and about Dorothea's list in a foreign language, and about 2 years of mornings at a window counter watching a hub I had helped design operate the way I had designed it to operate. I thought about a woman who could hear a failing system before the instruments could, who understood that infrastructure was the honest record of a city's values, who had said, "I would like to understand how cities decide to become what they become," who had sat in the cold even in the warm weeks and held her cup in both hands as if warmth was something to be held carefully, not taken for granted. I thought, she will be good at what she has to go back and be. She will understand the system from the inside. She will know what the decisions behind the decisions cost, because she will have paid some of them herself with mornings. I left the Tyne and walked home down Callow Street and checked the drainage grate at the corner of Venn and Aldrich, which was still correctly graded, which was as it should be. That was a year and a half ago. I still go to the Tyne every morning. The counter stool is empty. The dark roast that Fenn puts there, she started doing it, without my asking, some weeks after, sits there until I arrive, and then I move it 1 inch toward me and I drink it and I watch the hub operate and I note what is working and what is wearing and what could be better. I have taken to sending Briscoe more detailed notes than I used to. He calls them the drainage surveys. He means it as a joke. I take it as a compliment. I think she would find that funny. I think she would sit very still and not quite smile and look at the hub and say something precise about the grade of the observation and whether it was calibrated correctly. I think about her most mornings. Not with the grief shape that thinking about Dorothea sometimes has, which is a specific weight I have learned to carry cleanly. A different shape. The shape of something that was whole and good and correctly built, and that did what it was built to do, and that ended the way well-built things end, not collapsing but completing. She chose her mornings for 2 years. She chose them carefully and specifically, and with full knowledge of what she was choosing instead of. And then she went back, because the planner who understands the system from the inside is more valuable than they are to themselves. I think that is a very HFY thing, if you'll forgive the term. Not the fleet in the sky, or the impossible light at the temples, or the 7 symmetrical vessels doing the atmospheric math correctly. The HFY part is a woman with a sovereign's responsibilities sitting at a cafe counter for 2 years, learning a city from the infrastructure outward, choosing one ordinary morning after another because they were hers to choose, and a retired transit engineer who brought her the right coffee before she asked for it, who fixed the drainage grate, who told her the truth. The record, as she requested, is now as follows. Her name was Serapha Null while she was here, and she watched the number 6 line with the eyes of someone responsible for outcomes. And she chose, for 2 years, the same corner and the same cup and the same window onto the same hub, and she was right about the grate, and she was right about the city, and she was right that some things are worth choosing even when you know the choosing is temporary. The rest of the record belongs to wherever she went back to, and to the system she is now the planner of, and to the people inside it who needed her. I hope they know what they have. I think she is very good at her job. I think she always was.